Some artists appear more as complexities rather than characters. Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, or just Caravaggio, is considered the last true master of the Italian Renaissance, the era's swan song in the form of a man seen as everything from prophet to pederast. Master and murderer, killer and knight. Caravaggio was many things. He too died alone, horribly alone, the unfortunate victim of circumstance or malicious machinations. Arrested in the Spanish port city of Paolo, Caravaggio's ship left for his former home of Rome with all his worldly possessions, but without him. With only the clothes on his back, the feverish Caravaggio chased the ship down the Italian shore. Already suffering from syphilis and infected wounds, Caravaggio ran from Civitavecchia to Port Ercole. He tried to, at least. A few days later, he collapsed, dehydrated, with only the sun as his companion. Taken to a local infirmary, the controversial Caravaggio died a few days later, on July 18, 1610, at the age of 38. Already notorious in his time, the once renowned painter was discarded to a pauper's grave. But history has not forgotten Caravaggio. His death has long been debated. What killed Michelangelo Merisi? The man had no shortage of enemies. Caravaggio was the rock star of the Italian art world, equally hated and hailed by the young and old. Did an old nemesis assassinate Caravaggio, or was it simply his incompetence? There are no shortage of theories. The man's life is more controversial than even his death, a story told in scattered contracts, court records, police reports, and promissory notes. Nearly all his early biographers were his peers who despised him, Bellori or Mancini. Caravaggio became a knight, but fought a duel over a prostitute. He was a world-class painter, but also a gangster. His followers were called the Naturalisti for their style, but Caravaggio despised them. All across Italy, people wanted Caravaggio, or they wanted him dead. The man's figure has been so thoroughly mythologized. It is hard to talk about him as a part of history. Caravaggio was a character of either violence or romance. Despite being part of the Renaissance, Caravaggio was not with it. His paintings were dark, cruel, and realistic. His brush painted fellow streetwalkers, but apparently he could only work from model. There is no unbiased account of Caravaggio. The man was a firebrand who made waves and perhaps too many mistakes. Yet, he was not a rebel without a cause. Caravaggio was fully of Italy's art world and supported by it. His life and work thrived upon passion and absurdity, and his many deaths, social or physical, drew upon each an equal order. Caravaggio's story has always been a mixture of folklore and fact. Recent research, though, has proven he was not an uneducated nobody, but only the basic facts can be nailed down. It is known for certain Caravaggio was born in Milan, then part of the Spanish Empire, in the September of 1571. Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio's parents were Fermo Merisi, a well-respected stonemason, and Lucia Aratori, a woman from the town of Caravaggio, to where the Merisi family moved when plague struck Milan in 1576. But it was not enough. Supposedly in one night, Caravaggio's father and grandfather were killed by the plague, with his uncle dying soon after. Adopting the name Caravaggio in honor of his hometown and to hide his identity, Michelangelo was left with only his mother and siblings. While not impoverished, Caravaggio received only a rudimentary education. Most of his artistic training came from Simone Petriziano, who Caravaggio worked under as an apprentice for a brief period from April 6, 1584 to 1588. What ended the relationship is unknown, but it is likely Caravaggio's legendary temper had emerged at this point. Still, the 17-year-old Caravaggio had acquired all he needed by this point. Across all of Caravaggio's works, there is a superfluity of sex and violence. Even in his teenage years, Caravaggio was a notorious gambler and card sharp, which made plenty of trouble for him alone. He painted the world he saw in bars and on the streets. Across Italy, and mainly in Rome, Caravaggio styled himself one of the bravi, the era's equivalent to mafia or gangsters. His brand was a criminal with a canvas. Caravaggio's personality and experiences ooze throughout his entire oeuvre. The card sharps shows the world of cheats and tricksters. Bacchus is notorious for the fleshy substance of the figure and heavily implied homosexuality. The fortune teller displays a gypsy in the taboo act of fortune-telling. The figure of Narcissus is probably Caravaggio's commentary upon himself and his notorious vanity. Then the hyper-violent Judith beheading Holofernes displays an act of biblical justice. Until recently, Caravaggio was retroactively considered an outsider to the art world, but this is not true. There is no doubt Caravaggio had a controversial reputation, but he was not ignored nor an outsider. The term Caravaggesque, while originally negative, was used to describe his visual influence. An influence that reached even the Netherlands and the Utrecht Caravaggism style. Despite imitation being a form of flattery, Caravaggio was supposedly outraged whenever he saw another artist with a similar style, and he would fiercely defend his own paintings to the death. A notorious rage. Caravaggio was made an outcast by his earlier biographers, who, admittedly, hated Caravaggio and his work. Artistic figures such as Giulio Mancini and Giovanni Bellore cast Caravaggio as an outlier in art history. A man driven only by the devil and sin, but it was more complicated than that. Still, due to their writing, a bit of evil always lingers in Caravaggio's visage. The curious thing about Caravaggio is there exists nearly no notes, sketches, or preliminary work by him. He exists only in paintings and secondhand accounts. The man is more a character than an actual historical figure. He is then defined by what material exists from him. The color of Caravaggio's portraits casts his life as one of sex and violence. Caravaggio as a bloodthirsty savant of art. Not that that was reality. Caravaggio's lengthy court record disproves that, but it does confirm his violence. There then exist two images of Caravaggio, mythologized and real. The large gaps and scarcity of material in his life allow anyone to project upon him what they want. Caravaggio even encouraged this to some degree by straddling the line between sacred and profane. He buried his past and later denied knowing even his priest brother. Reality is blurry. Caravaggio smudged it. Even his arrival in Rome is mired in mystery. Once he finished with his master's workshop, the 17-year-old Caravaggio desired more. Several sources attribute his leaving Milan to either some sort of dispute or a murder, but all these are debatable and seem to have been added later. It is likely Caravaggio went to Rome because it was simply the most profitable opportunity, as Pope Clement VII had begun to restore the immortal city. Either way, Caravaggio spent his early career slumming with friends in Rome and pawning off his paintings when he could. Despite his poverty, his tastes were extraordinary. Caravaggio spent wildly and wore luxury clothing until it literally rotted off his body. Either way, Caravaggio's early career was literally ended with a kick. Supposedly by a donkey, but there may have been other reasons. His attitude and actions landed him in the hospital of Santa Maria della Concezione. He was either injured due to an altercation with friends, a street fight, or by being literally kicked by a donkey. Even with his already notorious reputation, Caravaggio's paintings circulated and brought him popularity across Rome. The paintings appealed to both the Roman elite and seedy underbelly, a coming together of sacred and sinful, represented by none better than Caravaggio's patron for the majority of his career, the Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte. After purchasing the card sharps, del Monte invited Caravaggio to live with him at his residence in the Palazzo Madame, from where Caravaggio would do a majority of his work from 1595 to 1606. Caravaggio worked as the Cardinal's personal artist and was paid a lofty amount. By his death in 1626, Del Monte owned 8 of Caravaggio's works, so even the church of the century embraced the equally morally questionable Caravaggio. Once he was established, he was wildly successful. It was his own hand that would destroy him. It was the Italian art world and elite that built up Caravaggio, but it also inflated his ego and temper. Even before his fame, Caravaggio was a narcissist. In looks, status, or ability, Caravaggio refused to be outmatched. The painter mixed his sanguine spirit with his work. Beyond even art, Caravaggio was looking for ways to prove himself. As the pioneer of the apex of the Italian Seicento, or later Renaissance, Caravaggio sought to act out his tempestuous temper. His motto was, without hope, without fear. To younger painters, Caravaggio, at the peak of his career in 1600, was untouchable. The favorite of Rome's elite, he strutted about both the elite circles and underground. Caravaggio desired to play out and experience the drama he depicted in his work. Fights were common inside and outside Caravaggio's group. Once, out of pure spite, he threw a dish of radishes at a waitress due to his taste. Whenever he went outside, the painter always took with him a sword. Of course, Caravaggio's Rome was a city of sin, but even at the tennis courts, Caravaggio went looking for trouble. How much is fact and how much is fiction is unknown. His taste and temper for violence were legendary, but definitely exaggerated. It is possible Caravaggio's temper, though, was due to lead poisoning. The artist was notoriously messy with his work, so the lead in his paint could have poisoned his perspective in some way akin to Van Gogh or Goya. There is no doubt Rome's social environment stoked his mood swings as well. Caravaggio tried to integrate himself among the bravi. He was a high roller in a world of prostitutes. One of them he fell obsessively in love with, supposedly. The best way to prove himself among these people? Violence. Between 1600 and 1606, Caravaggio's name appears in police records at least 14 times. Beyond wealth, a sword and scars best proved bravado in 1600s Italy. It was this bravado that would undo him. The face that led to Caravaggio's failure was that of his favorite prostitute, Philide. Where rumors and legends vary, Caravaggio supposedly fell in love with Philide in 1599. After that, her and her fellow woman of the night featured commonly in Caravaggio's paintings as models, as either common women or characters of the Old Testament. The issue was that Philide was a popular prostitute, one of Rome's best and favorite faces. In a few short years, Caravaggio's anger bubbled over at the facts. Either acting on this or goaded by it, his one rash action afterwards commenced his downfall. In 1606, Caravaggio went to the tennis courts as he usually did. It is unknown if what happened next was planned. All that is known is that Caravaggio cornered and killed Renunciation Tomasoni on that court. Tomasone was an enemy, but why exactly is hard to pinpoint. It is doubtful Renunciation was just a victim of random violence. The killing was clearly thought out to some extent. The tennis match beforehand seems to have acted as a pretext to the duel. Most agree Tomasone was either Philide's pimp or simply insulted her. In an act of revenge, Caravaggio either sought out or stumbled upon Tomasone with the intent to kill him. Either story resulted in Caravaggio killing him, so the actual reason is secondary to the murder. Historians only know it was an act of masculine bravado due to Caravaggio's failed intent. The wounds around Tomasone's groin indicate Caravaggio meant not to kill him, but castrate him, an action generally done among the bravi to preserve their honor after a rival had insulted their woman. Except, Caravaggio botched the stab, and Tomasone died from his wounds. With that, Caravaggio's reputation in Rome died. By summer 1607, he was forced to flee the city due to the murder. Totally abandoned and hunted, Caravaggio left Rome for Naples with one destination in mind: Malta. At this point in history, the Isle of Malta was still under the control of the Knights of Malta, otherwise known as the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, a remnant of Crusade politics. The Knights answered only to the Pope/Vatican in religion and politics, but were nominally independent otherwise. When Caravaggio arrived in 1607, the group was led by Grandmaster Elliott de Wignacourt, who styled himself a prince, who Caravaggio sought out to court. There were obvious motivations for Caravaggio's desire to become a Knight of Malta. He wanted both a pardon from the Pope and a new source of income. By becoming a knight, he would have the Pope's ear and acquire a noble status as well. As his reputation preceded him, Caravaggio intended to use his artistic reputation to acquire a place in the order, which succeeded. Flattering the Grandmaster with portraits and art for the church, Caravaggio was knighted. To some degree, his efforts were too driven by resentment. In Rome, he had still been a peasant and commoner, but now, as a knight, he could use his position to get back at his old enemies. Within the order, Caravaggio had his own emblem and portrait, no longer an artist on the outside alone, for a brief moment. Caravaggio's temper once more ruined all his work. A bitter exchange with a fellow knight resulted in insults, which terminated Caravaggio's place in the order. Perhaps chivalry was not for him, but the ordeal ended up with Caravaggio in jail refusing to relinquish his honorary cross. He was not placed in any prison, though. Caravaggio was thrown into the Castel Sant'Angelo on Malta, a supposedly inescapable fortress manned by the knights. That did not stop Caravaggio. Still claiming he was legally a knight, Caravaggio, by a miracle of pure rage, absconded from his cell and got to Sicily by 1608. After this, though, Caravaggio's life becomes confused and obscure until his eventual end. He mostly wandered about the western Mediterranean between Sicily and Naples for the next 2 years, always believing he was being hunted down by the Knights or the Vatican, but hoping he could one day acquire enough wealth or artwork to return to Rome. After an assault in Naples, Caravaggio was obviously degraded by 1610. He was heavily scarred and his paranoia led to increasing instability, not helped by his temper. But until his death on that sunny strip of beach, Caravaggio never stopped painting. His reputation went with him to the grave, though. Except, was Caravaggio correct in the end? Was he actually a hunted man? There is no consensus, but enough proof exists to say Caravaggio's fears were more than a conspiracy theory. It is unlikely, though. The Pope and Knights had more important matters in Christendom to attend to. It does not make Caravaggio's death any less odd, though. He was vaguely pursued by something, or some force, or maybe just the law. The artist was attacked by an unknown assailant in Naples in October of 1609. The attacker's identity has never been found out, but it was more than just a street scuffle. Rumors even circulated Caravaggio had been killed. The assault left Caravaggio disfigured, and the wounds he received would never truly heal. When they became infected, they were one of the contributing factors to his death. When Caravaggio's malformed corpse was dragged from the infirmary in Porto Ercole, none came to claim his body or even give it burial. Only his goods returned to Rome on a lonely ship with a supposed letter predicting his death. These fell into the rapacious hands of Caravaggio's old friend, the Cardinal del Monte. What was assumed to be Caravaggio's body was buried in the San Sebastiano cemetery under the watch of the local church, a lonely death mourned only by monks. For centuries, Caravaggio's grave was unknown. To this day, it is still debatable if the skeleton found was actually his, but a friar's note from the late 1600s seems to confirm the pauper's grave hid the remains of the grandiose master, Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio. The corpse, by 2010, was a scant few pieces of skeleton, a fragment of the frontal part of the skull, 2 jaw pieces, a femur, and a fragment of the sacrum. Despite the poor conditions, enough dried blood was found in the molars to confirm the remnants have an 85% match to Caravaggio's DNA. So, after 400 years, what truly killed Caravaggio? Malaria, syphilis, fever, staph infection, sunstroke, or assassination attempt? What was the final death of Caravaggio? Basically a mixture of all of them to varying extents. Caravaggio was killed by sepsis or blood infection triggered by golden staph infection. His condition at the time, exhaustion, dehydration, fever, did little to help. So, just like in his paintings, light is finally shined on the shadow of death of the violent and romantic Caravaggio, a man renowned as either a monger of the flesh or saint of the spirit. Controversial enough to be considered the first modern painter. Killer or knight, paint or picture Caravaggio with your own brush. History has not forgotten the body Italian, but nobody can truly decide who he truly was. Only that he was, and he was alone.